the headlines concerning egg-related bankruptcies are on the rise. Farmland here in the Midwest is abundant with farmers growing corn, soybeans, alfalfa, dairy, and beef. But recently, in the first quarter of this year, many farmers couldn't repay their debts. Farmers are under a tremendous amount of economic stress. Across America's farmland, daily life is filled with challenges. Weather, debt, and volatile prices already weigh on farmers. In 2025, tariffs have made the burden heavier. President Trump's trade war is not an abstract debate in Washington. It is a reality shaping whether family farms can survive another season. We worry about drought. We worry about pricing. We worry about equipment. We worry about financing. This tariff is just another thing that we have to worry about. One bankruptcy follows another. Across Iowa, Kansas, and Wisconsin, farm auctions are once again becoming common. The very places once seen as America's breadbasket are facing collapse. It is happening because the price of steel, fuel, and fertilizer has jumped. It is happening because global buyers are looking elsewhere for corn, wheat, and pork. China has slashed imports. Mexico and Canada have redirected trade flows. And farmers in Nebraska and Illinois are left with bins of grain they can't sell. It's not just about soybeans or dairy. It's about a way of life disappearing. When you travel through the Midwest in 2025, you see boarded-up grain elevators. You see shuttered processing plants. You see tractors standing still because parts are too expensive to import. The tariff war has crippled supply chains. Farm families are squeezed between higher input costs and collapsing markets. The average farmer is carrying hundreds of thousands in debt. Banks are turning them away. And Chapter 12 bankruptcies, meant for family farms, are surging. The trade war was launched as a political weapon. But the collateral damage is small towns. Every farmer lost is a store closed. Every bankruptcy is another school shrinking. Every auction is another generation leaving the land. The Midwest is being hollowed out, field by field. President Trump defends the tariffs as leverage. He calls them strength. But on the ground, they are strangling. A farmer in Iowa put it simply, you can't plant politics. You can only plant seed. And seed doesn't wait for Washington. The storm is not ending. In 2025, tariffs remain at historic highs. New rounds of retaliation keep coming from China, Europe, and Canada. Markets once lost are not easily regained. Brazil has overtaken the US as the top soybean exporter. Australia has taken beef contracts. Europe has shifted to Canadian wheat. The longer the war drags on, the less America's farmers can recover. This is not a crisis measured only in dollars. It is measured in empty barns, in foreclosed land, in families walking away. The farmer who has worked the land for 40 years is told he cannot survive one more. This is the legacy of tariffs on the ground. A war that Washington claims is for the nation's future. But a war that is destroying the very heart of the nation's present. Remember when Canada was America's quiet neighbor to the north? The one that always said sorry, played by the rules, and rarely made a fuss? Well, those days are gone. Because when President Trump slapped a massive 35% tariff on Canadian goods, expecting us to fold and come begging for a deal, Canada did the exact opposite. We hit back harder than anyone expected. And the fallout is reshaping trade, jobs, and even global politics in ways most people never saw coming. Now, on the surface, this looked like a tough move by Washington. Tariffs make headlines. They sound strong, and they're easy to spin as a win. But here's the truth. When you dig into the numbers, the actual trade reports, the corporate earnings, the industry filings, you discover something shocking. That so-called power play backfired. And not just a little. It backfired in a spectacular way. This isn't about political talking points. This is about cold, hard data. And I've spent months tracking it. What I found will flip the usual narrative on its head. Who really needs whom? Who came out stronger? And what does it mean when Canada, for the first time in decades, stops acting like the junior partner in this relationship? We're going to get into all of that. When President Trump announced a 35% tariff on Canadian goods, the strategy seemed simple. Flex American muscle. Scare Canada into concessions. And walk away with a deal on Washington's terms. It was classic strong-arm politics. But here's the problem. The numbers never backed it up. Most people heard 35% tariff and assumed nearly all Canadian exports would suddenly become more expensive overnight. In reality, 95% of everything Canada sells to the United States is still protected under the USMCA trade deal. That's autos, energy, agriculture, and countless manufacturing goods. The actual average tariff rate was closer to 2 to 5%, not 35%. In other words, the move looked tough on paper, but in practice, it barely made a dent. Economists have a term for this kind of overreach. A swing and a miss. It's like walking up to the plate with all the swagger in the world, taking the biggest swing you can imagine, and completely whiffing. The intent was intimidation. The reality, Canada stayed calm, steady, and smart. And here's what made this miscalculation even worse. Washington acted as though Canada were a minor player that had no choice but to comply. But anyone who actually looks at the trade numbers knows that couldn't be further from the truth. The United States depends on Canadian trade in ways Trump never accounted for. And by overplaying his hand, he set the stage for a backlash no one in Washington expected. One of the biggest myths in this whole tariff drama is the idea that Canada needs the United States far more than the United States needs Canada. That's been the story sold for decades. America is the giant. Canada is the junior partner. And if push comes to shove, Canada will always blink first. But when you dig into the actual trade numbers, that story falls apart fast. Let's start with jobs. Roughly 9 million American jobs depend directly on trade with Canada. Not Canadian jobs. American jobs. We're talking about auto plants in Michigan, steel mills in Pennsylvania, aerospace factories in Kansas, and farms across the Midwest. If Canadian trade disappeared tomorrow, millions of American paychecks would vanish with it. And here's the kicker. Canada isn't just another trading partner. Canada is America's largest customer. Every year, Canada buys more American goods than Japan, South Korea, China, the United Kingdom, and France combined. Add them all together and the total still doesn't match what Canada purchases. That number sits at a staggering $359 billion annually. So, let's put this in plain terms. If you run a business, do you pick a fight with your biggest customer? Do you threaten the partner who buys more from you than anyone else on the planet? Of course not. But that's exactly what happened. And by treating Canada like the weaker side of the relationship, Washington underestimated just how much leverage Ottawa really had. When Washington tried to tighten the screws, Canada didn't panic. It adapted. Think of it like running a business. If your biggest customer suddenly becomes unreliable, you don't just sit there and hope things get better. You start looking for new markets. That's exactly what Canada did. And the results have been nothing short of remarkable. Canadian exports outside of the United States hit record highs this past spring. Sales to Japan jumped by 23%. To Germany, they surged by 46%. And to the United Kingdom, exports nearly tripled. These aren't small numbers. They represent billions in new trade flowing away from American ports and into Europe and Asia. But it wasn't just big trade deals. On the ground, everyday consumer habits started shifting, too. Take wine, for example. When American wines disappeared from Canadian shelves during the dispute, something surprising happened. Canadians turned inward. Domestic wine sales skyrocketed, rising 60% in Quebec alone. At the same time, imports of US wine collapsed by a jaw, dropping 98% compared to the year before. This isn't just about alcohol. It's a snapshot of a broader cultural and economic change. When people are pushed to look local, they often discover they like what they find. Canadian producers gained market share, consumer loyalty, and confidence. What began as a tariff battle turned into a long-term boost for domestic industries, and a clear warning sign for American exporters who once took Canadian demand for granted. If there's one industry that shows how Canada turned a challenge into an opportunity, it's aluminium. For decades, Canada was one of the world's largest producers, especially in Quebec. But here's how the system worked. We mined and refined the aluminium, then shipped much of it south of the border. In the United States, it would get turned into cans, car parts, appliances, and then often shipped right back to us. It was a supply chain built on cross-border dependence. When tariffs hit, they struck on both ends. Raw aluminium going south, finished goods coming back north. At first glance, that might look like a losing game for Canada. But instead of doubling down on the old system, Canada changed the rules. Ottawa and private industry began investing heavily in domestic manufacturing capacity, particularly in can production. Why does that matter? Because it means jobs, revenue, and market share that once flowed to American manufacturers are now staying in Canada. By building out its own canning industry, Canada is poised to strip away more than $1 billion in business that used to belong to US companies. So, what started as punishment ended up sparking a new growth strategy. Instead of shrinking under tariffs, Canada expanded at home. And every car that rolls off a Canadian production line isn't just a product. It's a symbol of resilience. It's proof that when pushed, Canada doesn't break, it builds. The trade fight wasn't just about economics. It quickly bled into diplomacy. And here's where Canada made one of its boldest moves. In the middle of the tariff tensions, Canada officially recognized Palestinian statehood. Washington's response? Furious. President Trump warned that trade negotiations would get very difficult if Canada went through with it. But Ottawa didn't blink. The government went ahead anyway. And for the first time in a long time, the world saw a Canada that wasn't asking for permission from its southern neighbor. This wasn't simply about the Middle East. It was about sovereignty. It was about a country deciding that it would act on its own values regardless of how Washington reacted. For decades, Canada has been seen as the quiet partner. Loyal, reliable, and always in step with American policy. But this moment sent a message. Those days are over. Canada was no longer content to play the role of junior partner. Instead, it stepped onto the world stage with a stronger, more independent voice. And here's the connection to tariffs. Economic independence gives you diplomatic independence. When your entire economy relies on one market, you're vulnerable. But when you diversify, when you build strength at home, suddenly you can say no without fearing collapse. That's exactly what happened here. Canada turned an economic challenge into political freedom. And that shift may prove just as important as any trade statistic. While Canada was diversifying, investing, and asserting its independence, the numbers in the United States started to tell a very different story. The so-called tough tariff strategy wasn't weakening Canada. It was boomeranging back across the border. By May, the American trade deficit had jumped by nearly 19%. Exports fell while imports stayed flat. That means US businesses were selling less abroad but still paying higher prices for what they brought in. And nowhere was this more painful than in aluminium. Prices in the United States soared by 80% compared to just months earlier. Think about what that means in everyday life. More expensive beer cans. Higher costs for car parts. Pricier appliances. The average new car in the United States now costs over $48,000. The highest figure ever recorded. Families and workers, not politicians, are the ones footing that bill. Meanwhile, Canada was breaking free from its old reliance on U.S. energy markets. For decades, nearly every drop of Canadian oil and gas flowed south. But this year, Canada shipped its first LNG tanker to Asia, where buyers were willing to pay 35% more than American customers. Even more symbolic, those contracts were signed in euros and yuan, not US dollars. Each deal like that chips away at American leverage in global trade, while giving Canada fresh strength and independence. So, while tariffs were supposed to make America strong again, the reality is clear. The costs are piling up at home, while Canada is quietly cashing in abroad. So, here's where we end up. Washington tried to flex its muscles. But instead of breaking Canada, the tariffs pushed us to diversify, invest, and find our own voice. America is now facing higher costs, a weaker hand in global trade, and a neighbor that no longer plays the junior partner role. Canada came out stronger, more independent, and more confident. But what do you think? Does this confrontation make both countries stronger in the long run, or weaker? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit like. And don't forget to subscribe for more breakdowns like this.